Hey guys, today's Tech Tip Tuesday is centered around transmission pressure monitoring. It's a topic that's not very often covered. It seems like a little bit of a black magic type of thing, and every single transmission builder has a different pressure, where they want you to measure from, what type of dump valve and regulator. But the one thing that's consistent about all transmissions, especially in a race application, is you need to be measuring your pressure so that you can understand what's going on with your transmission, what's going on with your converter, and the changes that take place throughout the day of racing, as well as for the durability of the transmission and the engine as well. So I'll dig right in and we'll cover some of these topics. So there's a couple ways to measure transmission pressure. The number one thing that we'll talk about first is how to get transmission pressure. So most people are running AN lines on their transmission, and the best way to get pressure is to use one of these gauge adapters. So what it is, it's just a female and a male AN, and it, like this one is 6 AN. The lines on this Nova behind me are 6 AN. So it just gives you an 1/8 inch port. So basically the lines you already have, you can just reuse, and you just put this as like a sandwich, for a lack of a better term, in between the two locations. And then from there, you can either run just your standard 0 to 200 or 300 PSI transducer, or we just came out with this new Rife dual sensor setup with a bracket that we made to mount it to your actual transmission. They both work really well. The number one issue that I see from using standard transducer in the past is you have two separate plugs with two different gauge adapters. Putting the sensor right there where your lines are makes them extremely difficult to tighten. We'll get under the car and I'll show you what I mean. So this is a Powerglide under this car, and most people are racing with a Powerglide or a 400, even a lot of Ford guys are. It's just a really popular transmission style. The outlets are on the passenger side, and as you can see, I mean, this is an old car with not a huge transmission tunnel, but they don't get a whole lot bigger than this, and it's actually exposed. Some of them are actually, by the time you put a transmission, the lines are right there. But you can see that when we put that sensor right here, it makes it really difficult, A, to tighten this one, but B, to try and get that one. So you're kind of stuck tightening in an order of operations, which sometimes isn't always great. And then if you have a leak, it's really hard to get at the one, if, you know, of course it's always the one that you can't get to that's leaking. So it's hard to get to that. And also clocking of those lines can be difficult. And in addition, you know, when you go to take lines off, now you have sensors flying around and they ding off of stuff and they hit things and they stop working. So while it's tried and true and it's gonna work forever still, we went ahead and made something a little bit better, but I'll cover that here in just a minute. As you can see on this transmission, this is a Powerglide, and James, if you can come in here, you have your two ports. So this transmission was prepped by Performance Transmission in Illinois, and every transmission builder, a lot of these guys are making a lot of advancements in automatic transmission technology, and they're all really good at their job as far as I'm concerned. A lot of popular companies, and they all seem to have their own configuration of inlets and outlets. As you can see up here, if you can get in there, they actually block the top port out and only use the bottom port, and then the return line from the cooler goes right into the pan. Some companies do it this way, some don't. Different pump configurations make different, the lines go in different locations. But the one thing that's consistent about a transmission is it has to have a cooler line and a pressure feed line. So while those can be in different locations on transmissions, they both technically need to be monitored to really understand what's going on within your transmission. So one of the things that I was completely unaware of when I first started hot rodding, you know, I didn't really have like a high dollar transmission. I didn't really have a lot of knowledge around me or people telling me what to do. And to be honest with you, I feel like back then there wasn't even a whole lot of information going on the internet. The last like 5 or 6 years with dump valves and transmissions has just advanced so fast, because guys are trying to lock up converters. They're trying to remove fluid from the converter so they can spool faster and everything in between. And these transmission guys are getting really smart with all this stuff. The one thing, you know, we have a lot of customers who this might be their first or second build, and they aren't surrounded with all that info. So that's why we're doing the video today. The thing that's really interesting to know is if you take a transmission to Performance or any of these high dollar companies, they all do a great job. And when they typically will dyno the transmission after they build it, and that's after every rebuild they will dyno the transmission. That's A, to check for leaks, B, to make sure everything functions properly, that way when you put it in your ride it works. But what most of these guys do is they will actually check line pressure while they're doing it, and so they can mimic what your car is, and then they will set line pressure accordingly. So, and what's interesting is a naturally aspirated engine might be different than a supercharged engine, than a turbo transmission, and a street-driven transmission might be different than a race transmission. So when you call a shop like this, they will actually ask for a ton of information. And in turn, like Dave at Proformance gave me a bag of jets for my transmission. And basically what he's trying to do, and he's like, use this one when you start out. He's trying to get the pressure right where it needs to be. And the reason why is, A, it's going to make the converter act differently if it has different pressure. B, it's going to make the transmission act differently if it has different pressure. And C, it's for the durability of the engine. If you have a ton of pressure in your transmission, it can actually push the converter, with hydraulic force into the back of your crankshaft. I know we talked about it on the last video, setting crank to flex plate distance, but the next step along the way is, if you overpressure that, it'll actually hydraulic that converter into the back of the crank, and it will push the thrust bearing out of your engine. Most engines have a few thousandths of thrust built into them, which is just end play. But as soon as you overpressure that, it's going to just dig into that bearing and tear up your engine. And every year we see a lot of people that put a new combination together, have no idea what the pressure's set at. Their buddy built it in their backyard, which is fine, but they have no idea where the pressure's at, and they have no idea that they're basically just eating their motor alive because they're just forcing that converter into the back of the transmission. That's different than a anti-ballooning converter plate. So those billet plates that everybody talks about are actually just to keep the converter from ballooning on itself. So that doesn't actually affect this, or doesn't really counteract or affect this transmission pressure issue. So those are two separate topics. So just because you have an anti-ballooning converter plate doesn't mean you're going to prevent this from happening. The other things that can affect transmission line pressure is, have you burnt the transmission fluid? Were you on the brake for 10 seconds? You're going to change the properties of that transmission fluid. It's not going to act the same. What's the weather like outside? What's the temperature at when you launch the car at the line? What fluid style are you using? Different fluids, some are synthetic, some are not, and I'm not a chemist, but in between all of that, there's a lot of different properties that will affect pressure. What converter are you running? Have you changed the stator recently? Have you changed the converter? Have you changed anything inside the transmission? That's why these guys literally will dyno them every time the transmission's in the shop, because things can change so easily from such a huge amount of parts. And at the same time, that's why a lot of different transmission companies will suggest a certain type of fluid. A lot of people think, oh, you're trying to sell me, I'll just run this cheapo fluid. And that might work for some transmission, especially in transmission with billet parts and different gear sets. The way they're built and everything, a lot of them actually need a nice synthetic fluid to not pit and eat themselves alive. So that's important too. But all of these things all together mean that things change from day to day, from transmission rebuild to transmission rebuild, converter swaps, everything in between. Depending on how much boost you're running in the car, everything that you can ever imagine will change that. So what it's important for with a racer or an enthusiast is that we can measure this stuff. So, if something changes and all of a sudden it's hitting a tire really hard out of nowhere, but it's a hot day or a cold day, your transmission converter might be coupling differently or coming in differently. So while you're focused on your boost ramp, your transmission might be acting differently, and that's the culprit all along. Of course, it can be a combination of both. If you have pressure from the cooler and the feed line on your transmission, it'll at least give you some data that you can call your converter company, you can call your transmission guy, or just learn to understand yourself so that you can tune around it. Now, there's a whole lot of things like dump valves and all that stuff, which are more in depth and we won't cover them. But not knowing is not knowing. So if you don't know what any of that stuff is, how can you ever adjust for it or understand what's happening to change your tune-up or to give them information so that they can make changes to your stator or whatever is on board your car? So, do yourself a favor, whether you put in 2 of those pressure transducers or you run that Rife style sensor that we have, it's going to open up your eyes to what's changing. I mean, you data log everything else on a car: coolant pressure, oil pressure, EGTs, O2s, and I'll crawl under cars when I'm helping at track, and they literally have no pressure sensors on the transmission. They have no temperature sensors, and you're like, dude, that's 50% or more of your whole combination that you're just blind to. So this isn't a sales pitch by any means for you to buy sensors from us, but it's definitely going to open your eyes and give you a new perspective on what's happening, when it's happening, and why it's happening. So this is our new pressure block. It combines one of the Rife transmission dual sensor billet setups with a bracket that we made. It works on a Powerglide or a Turbo 400, and I suspect it'll work on a lot of other transmissions, though we haven't tried them on tons of other stuff. Just use 2 slotted holes, so it gives you a lot of ability to slide it back and forth, as well as different bolt patterns. You know, most transmissions have bolt patterns that are that far apart. But the nice thing is it has a 300 PSI for the pressure side, and then 200 for the cooler side, sorry. And then it has a 4-pin plug. And why this is really cool is to pull your transmission, no longer are you unplugging those sensors or having a bunch of different plugs and leaving those all behind and then fluids dripping out of a different location. You're gonna plumb this right up on your transmission, and so to remove your transmission, all you really have to do is unplug this and then take your regular transmission lines off. It gets the pressure sensors out of the way of tightening your regular lines on the transmission, which makes things really nice. And then it's dual isolated, so it has silicone and rubber in 2 spots to basically avoid dying from vibration, which is the main culprit for killing sensors, especially pressure sensors on engines. They just absorb all that vibration and eventually go bad. So these are basically anti-prone to that. And the 2 sensors that are here are really easily changed should you want to go up or down or change them anywhere in between. It's a quick change, and like I said, if you have a backup transmission, you can have one of these on each transmission, and you simply are just going to plug it back in when you put the transmission in the car and hook up your 2 lines, and you're done. So you're not fighting with getting pressure transducers back on, plugging them in, rotating them, tightening lines, trying to get around them. It's just one of those things that's really nice. And the cost of this is virtually the same as running 2 or 300 PSI pressure transducers as you would get from a popular EFI or sensor company. And they come with all the data to scale them in your EFI or data logger, so it's really easy to set them up, and they have a lot better resolution than your standard pressure transducer. So where this goes in the transmission is right here. As you can see, even with a tight transmission tunnel in this thing, it's going to bolt off of these 2 bolts, and we made it slotted so you can move it backwards and forward. We know people have some dump valves that hang off the transmission. You can slide it to get out of the way of the dipstick if you need to, as well as whatever other stuff that you may have in the way. So it's really nice, and then basically you would still use that same gauge adapter, and you would just run a line to each one of these. So you'd have a gauge adapter here, and you'd have a gauge adapter here, and you just have a short 3AN line that goes to each one of these. And like I said, you can leave it plumbed up between that location in and out of the car, and then you would just have to connect these 2 lines. And the other nice thing is they share a sensor power and a sensor ground, which are always hard to get into on most EFI systems because they don't have a lot of spare sensor powers and grounds. So you're going to have just 4 small wires in 1 plug. You remove that plug, leave it behind on the car, and you're good to go. So you don't have 2 or 3 different looms running down here to plug your stuff in. So now that you guys know where you're measuring and have seen some sensors, a lot of people will ask, how much pressure should I be running in either location? And the answer is, I don't have an answer for you. Typically on the cooler side, you'll see anywhere between 45 to 100 PSI, and some see even more than that. On the other side, you might see 200 plus, but I would definitely consult with your converter company and your transmission builder and possibly the manufacturer of the transmission parts you're using internally to basically match what they suggest, because what you're driving as far as the converter and the clutches and the gears inside the transmission will be dictated by, how well they work is dictated by the pressure. And I don't think there's any one size fits all between combinations and converters and everything in between. You're going to see some variance, and I would rather leave that information to them. So definitely reach out to them, and that's what good reason to have a good resource for a converter or transmission builder, because the good guys know and the good guys will tell you, and they'll get you set squared away. So I hope this helped you guys. The guys that have the most data, the guys that understand the most, are guys that are going to go fast. If you look around all over the country, the fastest guys are learning about their program because they're knowing what's going on. More data is more knowledge, and more knowledge allows you to go faster. This will give you a leg up on people, allow your engine to hopefully survive via no thrust issues, and hopefully just perform all around better. And I think that's something that's awesome for everybody. We're all here to enjoy the sport and make these things as fast as we possibly can with the tools and the money we have. So thanks for tuning in, guys. If you like this video, make sure to hit the subscribe button, the like button, comment below. We would love to hear what your ideas for the next Tech Tip Tuesday are. That's how we get ideas, and we'd love to share what we know with you. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.